This is Snake. Colonel, can you hear me?
Loud and clear. What's the situation, Snake?
Looks like the elevator in the back is the only way up.
Just as I expected. You'll have to take the elevator to the surface, but make sure nobody sees you. If you need to, contact me by codec. The frequency is 140.85. When you want to use the codec, push the select button. When we need to contact you, the codec will beep. When you hear that noise, press the select button. The codec's receiver directly stimulates the small bones of your ear. No one but you will be able to hear it.
Got it. Okay, I'm ready to go.
There are certain game franchises people will always remember when the PlayStation 1 is mentioned, and right up there with these gems is none other than Hideo Kojima's stellar stealth action game Metal Gear Solid. Towards the end of making my last devlog, I had made a mental decision to try and remake a PlayStation 1 game, and recently rumours of MGS1 PS5 remake were starting to surface again. However, since this wasn't coming out anytime soon, I thought I'd give it a go myself, but to make it interesting, I decided I'd do it all in Voxel. I started out by making a Snake character in Magica Voxel and even got people's feedback on how it looked. I then made some walk cycles, brought Snake into Unity, and created a movement script that would switch out the meshes on a time basis so Snake could walk around in the scene. Next, my focus was on making the cargo dock level, which Snake first infiltrates in the game. This level wasn't too bad as it's mostly comprised of large containers, a couple of barrels, a forklift machine, some boxes, an elevator, some rations, and a pipeline system of some sort. I made the containers and barrels first, then added some plain meshes to match the outline of the dock. I then found this texture which looked similar to the game and went around plotting down all the containers and barrels to match the original level design. Next, I used Pro Builder to build out the rest of the level, and realized this should have been my approach for the ground as well. I used the water shader I made for my Pokémon TCG remake and made the color green to suit the dock level. I then made the pipeline system where Snake originally appears, as well as the ration, forklift, some boxes, and the level was really beginning to take shape. As you may remember, Snake's goal in the first level was to sneak past all the Genome soldiers and get to the elevator at the back in order to get to the Shadow Moses hangar entrance. So I had to make the elevator first. I ended up dividing the elevator into three key parts. The platform which Snake gets on to take the elevator up, the vertical frame of the elevator which takes it up, and the front frame of the entrance. I imported the elevator into Unity, and it was fun simulating the elevator moment to see how it would look. Once the elevator was finished, I had to tackle one of the core, if not the most important gameplay mechanic, and that was the actual stealth gameplay. In MGS1, if the Genome soldiers were to see Snake, they would go into the alert state, and a countdown would begin where Snake had to either run and hide or take them out. If Snake could avoid detection, the counter would fall into the evasion state, and then finally the Genome soldiers would go back to patrolling. So I set up a Genome AI script that would manage all these states and behaviors of the Genome soldiers, using an enum system for those that care. Attach it to our bean soldier and tied it to a simple UI to begin with. The soldier would cast a ray out, and if it hit Snake, would enter into the alert state. Next, I kicked our bean soldier to the curb like I used Ragdoll and found a reference image of a Genome soldier from the dock level. I pulled it into Magica Voxel, which gave me a starting point to work with. I ended up spending more time than I probably should have on the enemy. I applied a similar approach where the Genome soldier had its idle mesh and two walk cycles just like Snake. I gave Snake a simple health bar and updated the Genome AI script to speed up the countdown when Snake was no longer visible by the enemy, as well as to switch to the evasion state and finally the patrol state when Snake got away. At this point, I decided to change it up and focus on the Shadow Moses heliport level. I started off by using Unity's terrain tool to make an outline around the Shadow Moses hangar, because if you recall, the game takes place in Fox Archipelago lying southwest of mainland Alaska, and from the game it looked like Shadow Moses itself was almost encapsulated by snowy mountains, so I sculpted some mountains around the level. I then began using Pro Builder to make the iconic heliport in the center of the map. Next, I used the containers we made for the dock level and tweaked them a bit to match what looked like electrical components or just metallic containers on the snowy part of the terrain. The portion of the level I tackled next was by far the most time consuming but well worth the effort. This was the actual Shadow Moses hangar itself. I did start off by using Pro Builder, but I found it became a bit difficult to work with as the structure expanded and I was more comfortable with tools like Blender. So I spent what was hours upon hours building out the hangar in Blender, so much so that I switched from building it to focus on different aspects of the game. I came back to the Genome soldier to add in shooting mechanics with a mesh for shooting their weapon, and a raycast that if it touched the player would reduce their health. I also added in this muzzle flash that I made for my RTS game Galactic Mercenaries, which I'm currently working on. Now, a normal person would next add in projectiles for their weapon because, you know, you want projectiles to hit the player, but instead I shifted back over to work on Shadow Moses again. Project management, ladies and gentlemen. Absolute and utter chaos. I still had so much work to do and decided to work on the snowy terrain. You may remember that in the game when Snake walks out onto the snow, he leaves behind footprints. For some reason I became obsessed with replicating this, even though I had not progressed in some of the core mechanics of the game. To replicate this effect, I made a shader that can be affected by a rendered texture to make it look like Snake is walking on snow. To do this, I followed a great tutorial by none other than Gabrielle. I highly recommend checking it out if you're looking for a similar effect. I then made and added some footsteps to a VFX graph to make it look like Snake was leaving behind footsteps. If you recall, there's also a bit of snowfall in the original game, so I used VFX to make some snowfall by using this snow fake I made in Photoshop. I really love the outcome, but it looks like there's a blizzard, and in the game it was some light snow, so I will need to come back and tone this down a bit. I continued to make more of the assets from the level, including the M548 cargo truck, better known as the SOCOM truck. I genuinely had to look up the name of that truck because I wanted to be accurate and actually know some stuff, even though I didn't look up other things. But we all know it's the SOCOM truck, am I right, guys? Am I right? I then continued painting the level and adding more of the containers and electrical components that are scattered throughout the level, as well as the fence at the beginning of this level. Now, something that is integral to every single Metal Gear Solid game to date are the codec conversations. This was certainly a huge portion of what pulled me into the original story back on the PS1. Given I had made the decision to make this game in a voxel style, I thought it'd be unique and fun to have the codec calls show their voxel faces. So first I took Snake's character and pulled him into Blender, where I took off the rest of his character and only left the head in. I also remember Snake having this cool smirk or raised eyebrow in his conversations a lot of the time, so I put a bit more detail in here to reflect this, and I did the same process for the kernel. I created a separate coded canvas in world space and added some panels, images, and text which I tweaked to make it look like the original game. I used the dialogue system I developed and used in my previous videos to start the conversations. Next, I created a script which would manage the raising and lowering of the frequency bars to make it similar to the game. I did this by using sliders and tweening the values up and down at the beginning, middle, and end of the conversations. Later, I also added the bobbling or bobbing of the heads to show who was talking, as well as a change in the alpha of the panel for the person speaking. Once the foundation of the codec was working, I moved on to another big and crucial part of the game, the inventory system. To access Snake's weapons and items, you would use R2 and L2 on the original PS1 controller, which would open up the inventory in both horizontal and vertical fashion. You would then scroll through the inventory, and whichever item or weapon landed in the right corner or middle of the inventory would be selected for you to use. You could also equip and unequip the currently selected weapons by using R1 and L1. This for me was always a very efficient and neat way to access items and weapons, even actually to this day, because you don't get pulled out of the game. So I replicated this effect by creating a scroll view in the main game canvas which would hold either all the weapons or items. I added images as child objects which would hold the different item and weapon icons, and then created a script which would effectively shift these weapon or item icons up or down the list of images, depending on whether you clicked up or down on the keyboard. Then I had another script on each individual item and weapon which would define the type of weapon or item equipped. We will need this for changing Snake's meshes or skin later on. Now, to make the icons themselves, I created them as blocks first in Magica Voxel and then took snapshots of them. I then found the original sound for the UI and tweaked it slightly for the game. Next, I tackled another core aspect of the Metal Gear Solid gameplay, and that's the radar system. For the radar, I made a separate render texture and added a minimap camera that would only render onto that texture. I then made a raw image UI and adjusted it to the top right with the render texture as the image. I then removed the player and enemy in the culling mask of our minimap camera and added a white dot for the player and a red dot for the enemy as game textures, but that only rendered to the minimap camera, again using the layer mask settings. In the original game radar, Snake's dot would flash on and off. To replicate this, I made a script that would switch the white dot game object on and off on a timed basis. Okay, let me take a breath. At this stage, the level was still looking a bit light, so I returned to the hangar and spent the better part of a week to finish it. The sad thing is that I could have spent another whole week adding even more detail to it, and I really wanted to, but we were running out of time. With the hangar in place, it really started to feel like Shadow Moses. I also had to add the elevator which Snake arrives on, but needed to make some changes so it matches the exterior view. And after making the changes to the elevator we made for the dock and adding it into the level, I sculpted the map to fit it into the level properly. Next, I found a set of fonts which matched the original MGS1 UI fonts, so I imported those into Unity and set it up. I also adjusted the health bar to better match the game. Going back to the gameplay, as it stands, when the enemy sees us, they'll chase us, but there are still two big problems here. Firstly, the UI doesn't update like in the game to indicate that we're in the alert or evasion state. So I added a red panel overlay for the alert stage and an orange panel overlay for the evasion stage, with a black image across the top that includes text to show which stage that we're in. I also made it so that the alpha of the colors smoothly shifts back and forth to obscure our radar while we are in both stages. The second problem was that the enemy would shoot at Snake, but we didn't have any bullets project towards the player, or any way to shoot back with Snake. So I made a simple bullet in Blender and set it up to be fired at the player when in range. For Snake, I made several additional meshes for shooting with the SOCOM, movement cycles with the SOCOM, and similarly for moving and throwing grenades, as well as a diving suit mesh mesh that we have in the dock level. At this point I also set up communication between the inventory scripts and our player movement script, which will swap out Snake's meshes based on what weapon we have selected in our inventory. And I copy and pasted this approach for the items as well. Oh look, a vent, wouldn't it be cool? I created this crouch mesh as well as a crawl cycle with 2 meshes. Now we could crouch and crawl around the level, which was really satisfying, even though our character was a bit top heavy and kinda totally looked like Johnny Bravo. If you recall in the game, we could also go into first person view by pressing triangle, but unfortunately you couldn't play it in FPS view. So I used Cinemachine to set up our FPS camera. When holding right click, the camera would now smoothly shift to FPS view, and I made it so you can play in FPS mode if you wanted because it was so much fun. I also added a third camera that would activate if you started crawling, just like in the vents. And you could actually crawl around the level with this first person camera as well. Next I made this camera model in Magica Voxel. In the Shadow Moses heliport, if you recall, there were a total of 3 cameras. One in the room to the left of the heliport, one on the far left corner of the map next to the vent, and one next to the stairs to the second floor. The heliport was looking a bit, let's face it, unfinished, so I imported it into Blender and improved it. Once this was done, I went to tackle all the pickups that you can collect in the game. I made the pickups themselves in Magica Voxel. Since I already made the ration, I just had to make the chaff grenade case, and this case was used for the stun grenades that you collect in the room next to the heliport. I also made this custom SOCOM pickup in Magica Voxel, which kind of differs from the standard chaff grenade box, but I thought it was fun and kept it in. Next I added a system that would add those pickups to our inventory as well as in-game text, just like in the original game where you see the text pop up for a brief second. I also used the same script and mechanic to add the icon exclamation mark above the genome soldiers when they spotted Snake. I set up another Cinemachine camera right outside the SOCOM truck, which was triggered when Snake approaches the truck to give us an inside view of the truck, just like in the original game. I used the same script for the room next to the heliport. I then spent a good bit of time finding all of the original sounds for things like shooting, picking up items, crouching, using the ration, as well as the background audio for the dock and the heliport, and when enemies go into the alert state. I did some editing in Audacity to all the sounds for copyright reasons, and although I absolutely loved the original audio, it did feel like the tweaking was necessary for a voxel type game. At this point I realized that the Shadow Moses incident takes place at night, so I used this cartoon style skybox I found off the asset store. If you remember, I'd used the daylight version of it in my Pokémon TCG remake. I'm actually really surprised at how good these skyboxes are given that they're free. Next I added spotlights in the SOCOM truck and the room next to the heliport as it was quite dark. Effectively 2 months in and I had majority of the core mechanics done. However, I'm very conscious there's a whole lot more to do. So if you're interested in seeing me complete this game and post more content, let me know by leaving a like. I'm also really eager to know what you think of the game so far, so please let me know in the comments with your feedback and any suggestions you might have. And I'll see if I can get away with publishing the game for free on something like itch.io. If you enjoyed this video and you're new to the channel, do consider subscribing and hitting that bell, and if you want to support the channel, feel free to join my Patreon. As always, drink some coffee, code, and I'll catch you in the next one.